You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG. Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries. This is a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games, where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, interpreting monster abilities. Hello, sages and adventurers. My name is Matt, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Jody.
Hey, man, I am ready to get into some darkness here.
The darkness plus
my old
shadow friend equals fun.
That's their t-shirt. Print them.
There you go. Kelsey, that one's free. You can have that one.
Yikes.
It's got a Creative Commons license on it. Today's episode focuses on a recent experience Jody had running a classic monster. I'm so excited to talk about this. Running the Shadowdark rules, of course. So, Jody, why don't you take us to the table, my friend?
All right. I was recently asked to run a demo of Shadowdark at our local board game cafe. Unfortunately, on the day of the event, only one of the players who'd signed up was able to make it on the day.
A truly classic of the role-playing game genre here.
The true villain of every campaign. Scheduling. Alas, but the player was a veteran of 5e D&D. They were keen to see something new and something where I later learned, quote, victory was not assured. And so we pressed forward. The player selected to run two characters, a wizard and fighter. I had some pre-gens ready to go. And they were going to set out to explore the depths of the quintessential dungeon. Now, just as a brief aside, this is off topic. If you haven't run or you are not aware of the quintessential dungeon, do yourself a favor. Finish the episode. We won't take too much of your time. But afterwards, go check out the quintessential dungeon. It comes from the Beholder Pie blog by Will Doyle. We'll have a link in the notes. Oh, this thing is such a treat. It is. I have run it now twice. I have absolutely reveled and delighted in every moment of running it. My players midway through have gone, oh, this is like classic stuff. And I'm like, yep. It is called the quintessential dungeon because that's what it is. What are all of the like classic old school tropes? They're in there.
Yeah, I have played through a lot of it, I think. I don't know how big it is. One of our party members is still down there, apparently, wallowing in the darkness. But I don't want to take too much time away from the setup here, Jody, but I thoroughly enjoyed playing through it, and I just want to point out one little piece from a player perspective. It doesn't feel overly tropey. Like, it doesn't feel like the only reason that the dungeon exists is to shoehorn as many tropes in as possible. It makes sense.
Yeah, it works.
So,
and it's a one-page dungeon, which is, if I didn't say that piece, it's one piece of paper, and you can run from the one piece of paper and your Shadowdark core rulebook, and you have more than enough to keep an afternoon and a party busy and terrified. All right, so overall, though, the game went great. Me, one other player, his two characters, we both enjoyed the session. However, as our time in the day was winding down, our two intrepid heroes had just smashed through a heavily fortified, bejeweled door, revealing a 20 by 20 chamber beyond. Now, carefully stepping through the remains of the door, two brazier torches flickered to life, casting cold light upon a central plinth in the room. Atop the plinth, sitting at about waist height, a treasure chest glistens. The player, having learned keen lessons about exploring the room in previous encounters and questioning things and checking out the contents of the room, began his inquiry and exploration. Lo and behold, it was revealed that a thin, clear discharge seems to be oozing from the chest on the plinth at the center of the room and making its way all the way down to the floor. The wizard astutely identified this liquid as saliva. It's a mimic. But surely a monster such as this, a treasure chest, alas, would hold treasure within. Forming a quick plan between his two characters, the wizard and the fighter commit to battle with the beast. A battle ensued for 6 glorious rounds, and I am sad to report that chamber and the chest upon the plinth lie fully intact to this day, with no sign of those intrepid heroes who sought to claim those riches. Man. I demoed the game and it was a TPK, but it was both a great time for me, and the player had nothing but good things to say and was a smile and was a champ about watching his 2 characters go down the gullet, 2 characters down the gullet of a mimic. Oh boy. So that was the experience we had is playing this mimic in this dungeon. But as I was playing the mimic, I want to get to the core of why this episode. So other than just having some fun with this dungeon and everything else that goes with it, I found myself reflecting on that battle between those 2 first level characters versus a mimic. The quintessential dungeon must be quintessential. Yeah. It does, in fact, include a dragon. So do as you will. But the mimic, as it was devouring the PCs or slapping them around, I was reminded of the power of the only rule. You can find it on page 102 in your core rule books, about the various ways to interpret the mimic's attacks and abilities. Now, the only rule, if you're unfamiliar with Shadowdark, is that you make the rules, right? That this is a toolkit. Kelsey has been incredibly open about do what you will with this game, that she has built what is a marvelous chassis to expand upon or subtract from, I suppose, if you want to go that route. So as I was playing this mimic and watching it gobble down these heroes, I really found myself marveling at how much room I had within the mimic's very simplistic attack and ability combination. So just for argument's sake and setting it clear, the mimic has 2-bite attacks at +5 that do 1d8 damage plus stick. Stick is as follows. Here is verbatim on how stick works. DC 15 strength or adhere to target, auto hit with bite. New sentence. DC 15 strength on turn to remove. That's it. It's 2 very, very short sentences in the style and beauty that is Shadowdark. So I found myself both in the moment and afterwards pondering the following. Can the mimic bite more than one character? What about the classic tongue/pseudopod nature of the attack from the mimic? Does the strength check on the PC's turn count as their action? Is it fun to have 2 attacks in the mimic if there's only 2 characters? All of these were things I had to make rulings about in the moment in order to provide the best possible experience to my player. And I thought it was really fruitful ground to talk about and ponder not only the mimic, but the nature of the streamlined rules that are Shadowdark.
Really, Jody, what I want to do is I want to kick this thing off with a question. You're TPKing the new guy? What are we doing here?
Yeah, all right. Well, yeah, we might as well address the ogre in the room, I suppose.
No. So first of all, awesome. It sounds like the game was really cool. That's not actually my first question. My first question is actually, so you ruled a particular way.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell me how you ruled, and then I want to get right into the the meat of this, which is, do you change a monster and what it can do? Reducing the number of attacks, reducing the DC, etc. Or do you make a monster more challenging, depending on the party that is engaging with it? In a discussion that is like opening a Pandora's box.
Yep.
But we're going to address it here because that's what we do.
Here's what I did. So here was the choices I made in the heat of the moment. 1, I have 1 player playing 2 characters, not a quintessential dungeon ideal. You would like a larger party of people in this dungeon. Knowing that there are only 2 characters and this monster has a +5 to hit and does D8 damage plus an additional layer on that, I immediately dropped it down to 1 attack. It is 1 attack, and I opted for the classic, in keeping with the spirit of the dungeon, the classic tongue attack. And so the way I modified the heck out of this, to some degree unintentionally, I didn't fully realize until I went back and really read through this monster in in retrospect and like getting my thoughts together about it, there is no pseudopod attack. There is no tongue attack from the mimic in Shadowdark. It has no appendage that reaches out to grab things. It is a close attack only. It's got to be that within 5 feet if you like that style. So I cut it down to 1 attack. I did rule that it could attack within near, but that first attack, all it did was adhere to the target, and they even got a test against the DC 15 strength to see if the tongue stuck. Now, their future turn, it would be a further DC 15 strength check, and as their action to remove the tongue, but the creature would pull them in. So the first attack just pulled you in towards the mimic, and then if you were still stuck when it was the mimic's turn again, then it auto hit as written. So I changed a ton of stuff. But all those changes were intended to balance against the number of characters in play, the fact that it was a tutorial and was not setting out to TPK, knew this was the end of what we were doing. There was either going to be a big treasure here or not because demo game. So I actually made quite a few changes on the fly, but they all kept the core numbers in place other than the number of attacks. And frankly, it just wouldn't have been fun. If this thing had 2 attacks, it would have just gobbled these guys up like immediately, and there wouldn't have been an issue. And instead, what happened, I mentioned that this combat literally ran for 6 rounds, was somebody went down, somebody got up, somebody got pulled back, somebody got pulled free, somebody else got pulled in, and it was this back and forth where finally he was like, you know what, I'm just going to let the fighter stay attached, and hopefully his hit points are enough to take it. Great hit fighter kind of mentality. I'm going to hit it with the longsword. Unfortunately, he rolled terribly and just wasn't able to do much of anything to this. Bad player rolls, average GM rolls, and a critter that's way out of their range gets you a TPK. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but those were the hacks and chops I made in 2 parts. One, maintaining the fiction of what a mimic is. The player exclaimed, "Oh, awesome. I've never fought a mimic before." Right. And it's amazing. You and I have heard that so many times since we've been playing Shadowdark of like, oh, a gelatinous cube. That's awesome.
Okay. So I want to hit the pause button because gelatinous cubes, definitively not awesome. Definitively one of the worst. I mean, Jody, if we can take a moment here, again, a game that you were running where I was a player, I think we had the platonic ideal of a gelatinous cube, a truly classic monster, showing why it is just the most frustrating and horrible monster. I mean, we had like 5 PCs and we just couldn't figure out how to do it.
You guys got away fine, and nobody died.
Nobody died. It was such a complete and utter disaster. These classic monsters, it's great to be able to bring them to players who are familiar with them, who are familiar with like the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons, but who haven't had an opportunity, maybe not even like play old school games, but just had an opportunity to kind of like engage with the game as if they were, for lack of a better word, like a kid.
Yeah.
Where it is a little bit of like wish fulfillment in a way. You know, like you told the player there was a mimic. You were very clear. I mean, it's not like the player didn't know what he was doing.
They were like, "Oh wait, it's saliva. Oh crap, this is a mimic. Would my play?" And he to his credit said, "Would my characters know this?" And I said, "You're running a wizard. I'm pretty sure a wizard would know what a mimic is." And he goes, "Okay, so here's what I want to do." And it did this quick little like, the fighter's going to do this and the wizard's going to do this. You know, so maybe that's the first spot to begin this talking about rules as written versus rules as interpreted. And I'm going to throw a 3-way triple threat match on here versus rules that are so streamlined you have to interpret them. What I did that I feel very comfortable in, even with the TPK, I feel comfortable in this.
Yeah, I think you should.
Is that I played to the fiction of what we have seen. Thank you, Dungeons & Dragons movie. A mimic to be, right? Like everybody who has seen that movie has a very clear picture of what a mimic does. And the tongue attack is a thing. If you've ever seen a picture, most miniatures of mimics have the big old slobbery tongues swinging around out there. So I played to that fiction. So that's why I feel comfortable with the choices I made. But I think maybe the more interesting spot that I want to spend a little time is this interpretation piece, because a lot of the critters in the monster section have abilities that read kind of like stick from the mimic. DC 15 strength or adhere to target. How do you rule that? What happens on an attack? How does that play out step by step?
If I were running the mimic, I would give it the ability to try and stick to something, right? And I would probably rule it being in near range. However, the way I would rule it is that it costs one of its bite attacks to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would allow it to potentially use another bite attack to do what everyone's favorite multi-tentacled roper does, which is like bring you in.
Yep.
So I just add another thing here. What you're asking is how would I interpret this rule? And what I gave you was I would add something to it.
Yeah.
And I would use those two. Basically, the way I see this is when I see a monster that has 2 attacks, I see the monster has 2 things it can do on its turn, which means that it doesn't adhere to the confines of the player action economy.
Yeah.
Players have 1 action on their turn, and it is very advisable for GMs to not give their PCs an additional attack. So when I see an attack 2 bite plus 5, etc., 1d8 plus stick, what I see is this monster can do 2 things on its turn, and it's probably going to want to bite. However, if I wanted it to, I could probably have it stick to something and pull it in and do no damage, right? And then bite it on the next turn. Now, this is the way that I think it's supposed to work. Stick means that you make a bite attack, your first of your 2 bite attacks, right? You make your first bite attack, you succeed on that bite attack, you do 1d8 damage, and then you force the character that was hit by the bite attack to make a DC 15 strength check. They fail the check, the target is adhered. The next bite attack automatically hits.
That same character. Okay.
That is how, and I would say is if the mimic has stuck to something, it cannot stick to anything else. It cannot bite anything else until that specific character has been devoured, or has made that DC 15 strength.
So on a future turn, were that character unable to extract itself from the maw, it would take effectively 2d8 damage.
It would
Both
take
attacks would
2d8 damage.
You just take
the
2d8.
Full on 2d8. No, don't roll. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. And don't bother with that character. Roll up a new one.
Yeah.
So
we gently slide you a character sheet while we're rolling dice.
Jody, you actually said this, and I don't want to steal your thunder here, so I want you to explain what it means. You told me, you're like, I actually think it's a good idea for folks to sit down and just read through the monster section.
Yeah. Man, what a treasure trove. So we transitioned a long-term campaign I'd been running to Shadowdark for the big conclusion because we'd had a huge break, and I frankly did not have the bandwidth to go back to learning the rules system, which was far more complicated we'd originally been playing in, and I'd been playing Shadowdark exclusively for the past year plus now, and was like, hey, can we do that? But one of the characters was a wizard or a druid. And so I started redesigning how would this druid work, and I was cobbling resources from the internet together, and we built something that the player and I both agreed felt like their character. That's what we were aiming for, is what feels like your character, but allows us to use the streamlined nature of the Shadowdark rules to tell the story. Lo and behold, there's a druid in the monster section. Daggum, that would have made my life easier had I found that thing, because it was a level 8 druid, so there was a lot to figure out, and holy cow, did that help? Would that have helped? So many monsters have really interesting abilities, spell options. One of them, gosh, I just saw, we've been playing with the idea in my campaign setting. There are gnomes. They are a young fae race, so they are somewhat anti-magic in a weird way. Like it just doesn't stick. It's hard to get magic to stick to them. Well, I was reading one of the monsters, and it's like, oh yeah, anytime you target this monster with a spell, an aggressive spell, it's just DC 15 to cast it. And I was like, that would have been such an easy answer. I went through all these writing drafts and looking at stuff, and if I just read the monster section, there are so many good ideas buried in these abilities for you to interpret and make use of and move around, and I mean, that's the magic thing. Like, the one rule is that you make the rules, but there's so many freaking awesome ideas in this section of the rule book, in the monster section, for you to give your players a cool, you have a player who says, for my learning, can I forego a talent roll on a level up because I want a special ability that's unique to the way this narrative is unfolded for this character? Go to the monster section. Do yourself a favor. Start flipping through the monster section. The air quotes feat you are looking for, the talent you are looking for, is in there, or inspiration to get you there that feels in line with what Shadowdark does mathematically and conceptually as a game. It's really powerful. So when you look at the Mimic, going back to that point, it's this great set of abilities of like, oh, what would a restraining attack look like, right? Like, I want to grapple somebody. I want to put them in a headlock. That's not that different from stick, right? Go look at the stats on how strong is a Mimic, how strong is the character, is if DC 15 feels appropriate. Are you giving up the damage to do this thing? Like, those questions are easy to answer, but now you at least have a framework of something else that does something similar. So, man, it's a powerful tool. That section of the book I slept on and in the last few months have really felt both empowered and foolish, because I was like, it's been like a year and a half and I didn't notice this because I was running, goblins and kobolds, who are shockingly a pain in the butt. Man, it's just such a good toolkit. And the Mimics, a good example again of this loose framework of interpretation. I want
to go back to my opening question, which I don't know that I framed particularly well, which is basically, do you adjust the difficulty for an encounter? Do you adjust the difficulty of a monster? I mean, this is like the age-old question. We're not going to answer it here. I'm going to give you my answer, and then I want you to kind of give me your thoughts on it. So, when I run a much more generative at the table game than you do, by and large. Not. I mean, it's not like worlds different, but I do tend to allow die rolls to tell me what monsters show up, to dictate the story of the game, I think, more than you do.
I have a populated map most of the time.
And our Dolmenwood game runs in a populated world, but so much of what happens is based on random die rolls. And the vast majority of those die rolls I do at the table in the moment. So what that means is, sometimes I roll up things, and I have to do 2 levels of interpretation, because Dolmenwood is not built to be run with Shadowdark. It's built to be run with a basic or expert adjacent rule set. So I'm interpreting and kind of quote unquote converting monsters that are Dolmenwood specific, because holy cow, it feels like everything in Dolmenwood is Dolmenwood specific.
Yeah.
And I'm taking their stats and kind of coming up with stats and using kind of metrics. So I'm already doing a whole bunch of converting. The things that I can look up in the Shadowdark rulebook, I see as the exact same thing. I run them through a filter of what is happening in this moment. All of this is to say that I don't think it is bad to adjust monsters' difficulties. However, what happens when you start doing that and you start fiddling with these things is that you are playing with fire, right? Yeah. I think this is the
very
age-old
slippery
question.
Slope.
And so what I do is I roll all my dice out in the open. And I try and be very clear, and I say out loud what the monster's armor class is. I say out loud what the DCs are for various things. I would tell the player this is a DC 15 strength to unstick, so that those things then become locked in.
Yeah.
This is the thing that I think is really important what you want to do is, if you start fiddling with stuff, you run the risk, if nothing is said out loud, you run the risk of your players not believing any of the stuff that you're doing is actually real. So setting the truths of the encounter early and locking those things in, if you're going to make changes, you got to make them early, and waiting until the end of the combat to just like reduce the hit points of the monster dies or whatever. That's the kind of stuff where you start really playing with fire the further you go and the fewer things that you give transparency to. How did that hit your ear, Jody? Where are you at?
The argument that can't be hand wave dismissed no matter how much one camp tries to do so, is that if you're making those adjustments for the good of the story, not for the good of the player, for the good of the story, that this will tell a more compelling story, that's hard to argue with. The players will have a better time if, again, not the player, the players. And that's a tough call to make. And that's where the modern versus old school debate happens, right? And I certainly have my own feelings in that, but that's hard to argue. I cannot agree with you on, at the point the first die of combat is cast, those things need to become largely immutable. Man, hit points is the really dangerous one.
Yep.
If the hit point meter is sliding around,
yep.
That is the end metric. That's the decider, right? Hit points are the decider. When you are out of them, things happen. So that's the one. Now, if the point we start rolling dice, you have made some decisions like I did, right? One attack.
Yeah. If
it hits, it sticks. And then, continuing, it drags you in and. Those my own interpretation of the mimic, I definitely change things. So clearly I'm on board with changing stuff and moving things around. But I am with you that once that initial set of dice start rolling, somebody's dealt damage or not, then you kind of have to live in that first draft. One of the things that is, there's a couple different, I'm reminded of Matt Colville in all this. The mimic my player saw was a mimic, wasn't the mimic.
I love this.
Right? That's such a good argument that there are many mimics out there. There are mimics that look like treasure chests. I have a bed mimic that I own. I have an armoire mimic, miniatures, that is, of models of
that
these
armoire mimic is the jam.
Yeah, it's from Zenit Miniatures, I believe. I'll look and throw it in the notes. So there are many flavors of mimic. They can interpret and shift into many different shapes and things. So yeah, they'll have different abilities. The bed mimic I have has this massive tongue sticking out of it. I believe that's a Reaper model. It would feel weird if the tongue didn't do something and you used that model in your game. Or you described this massive tongue lashing around the room, but then it only attacked things that were immediately next to it. Like those. So I'll go back to that point of, yes, adjust things. Like you found this is a version of this monster. This is a version of this kind of thing. But yeah, make sure it's true to the fiction, that your players aren't going, wait, this thing can do what? That doesn't make sense. Like it should make sense. They should go, okay, yeah, I'll buy that, and never think about it. And then, yeah, if you are sliding scale during combat on numbers, if your game is exclusively about the player's narrative, right, what the players are doing, I don't see a problem with it, honestly. If the style of game you are running is we are telling the story of these characters exclusively, then the monster is there to serve that story. And what the numbers say aren't super important. They're less important. They're still important. The dice rolls have to mean something. Otherwise, what are we doing here? That's a huge part of it for me on that dangerous line. And I think every GM needs to make that determination and probably should be pretty clear with their players about it. Matt and I both roll in the open. We don't play behind a screen. It's really funny. Like, I think you and I are both of the same mind of like, I have tried a bunch of times to use a screen again and just
can't do it. I wanted to add one addendum to our conversation because we're not going to solve do you change the encounter after the encounter starts? Like this is one of those, like, your table, your thing. I gave my answer, which, like, my answer probably would be different tomorrow. So, this is something people get pretty feisty about. I want to add one thing, which is that when you're making interpretations about monsters, sometimes you don't realize you're going to have to make the interpretation because you speed read the monster stat block, or if you're like me, you don't know a monster is going to show up, and suddenly you're faced with like, oh crap, I just rolled a mimic, and okay, Shadowdark's the easiest system to just turn to and like start running the monster, but like, okay, it looks like I'm going to have to make a call here. You might make the wrong call on the first round. You might do something that's like, oh, that was not how the monster was maybe intended to play or how I should have interpreted this. I don't like my interpretation. And that's the other thing that I think is really important is if you make an incorrect interpretation, it is okay to the next round on that monster's turn or right afterwards, after a player's turn. Don't interrupt the player's turn. Don't interrupt their train of thought. But like, when the time is right, just say, hey, I made a mistake in terms of the way that this monster is going to act. We're going to change that the way that auto hit works. I read this as a DC 12 strength check. It was actually supposed to be a 15. It's a 15 from now on, or whatever it is, right? Like that happens. And
I assumed it has a pseudopod tongue.
I mean,
which it doesn't.
Yeah. So you can go back and change things. You can retcon things, but I also think that there is a purity to interpreting things the first time you read them and running the monster like that.
Yeah.
And then not every monster is going to run the same. And that's the last thing I wanted to bring up is that in terms of changing monsters around, there's an incentive to do that as a GM, especially when you have monsters like the Mimic that are going to be coming about in different forms, right? Like I would expect that a monster that's a bed would have a different set of action. Like if it's a big bed, I would assume that DC might be 18 strength to get out, right? Because maybe it clamps around you.
Yeah, you lay down on it, gulp.
Right? Like, I mean, we're talking about some situational stuff.
What's an anglerfish?
So, exactly. I think our conversation, and I don't know how you feel about this, and we're going to hop over to our kind of takeaways in just a moment, but I think this conversation it brings about a lot of bad feelings when we start talking about like combat and changing the way monsters work, because then we start to see the edge of the map.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is in the video game where you're running against the edge of the map. We start to realize that this is where we start to go, oh crap, all of this is made up. Nothing is actually real. Where do I get my grounding from? Like, where do I actually ground myself? The thing I want to say is trust your instincts. Trust your instincts. If you think it would make sense for the Mimic to do X, Y, or Z, then you can probably find a way to make that happen that is reasonable, that feels right to your players, that adds drama, and isn't unfair.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great part to kind of close us out here. As long as there's been RPGs, we've been having this conversation. Page 102, the Game Master, the only rule, and the Pact.
Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by Wizlock, the industry leader in treasure security. Wizlock is an easy-to-install security system that uses patented arcane technology to monitor your hoard of wealth while you return to the dungeon for more. With so many names and ne'er-do-wells about looking to abscond with your loot, don't rely on a simple lock and key. Put your trust in Wizlock. It's easy to install. Just carve the arcane symbols into the doorframe, secure the gem above the keystone, and recite the script on the Getting Started scroll. It's as simple as that. Even non-magic users can install Wizlock with our patented Magical Dabbler Potion add-on. Those without arcane knowledge and tomes will be able to install the device during the potion's 1-hour use window. Now, if you would like to ensure the safety of your loot today, send a raven to Wizlock with your information and mention Dungeon Master Diaries. They'll send someone out to your abode for a free consultation, and no purchase is required at all. So if you want a no commitment, free consultation, reach out to Wizlock now. Wizlock. Outsmart the knaves. All right, Jody, let's go over our core takeaways from this discussion. I will start. You gotta trust yourself, and if you screw up, you gotta own it and come to your players. But like ultimately, Shadowdark is a tool set, and that tool set is great because it doesn't require that you bring a whole lot to it other than your imagination and your a willingness to think about what might or could or would happen in a particular moment. So I hope that's not too abstract. Trust your judgment. Trust your instincts. Jody, what is your first?
I'm going to flip it to the other side of the screen with a very similar message of, for me, what are my players' expectations of this monster? Like, I'm going to stay living just with our monsters for now, but what are my players' expectations of this monster? When they meet the leprechaun in the woods and he tricks them, are they going to be shocked and disappointed that a leprechaun tricked them in the woods? No, that's what he's supposed to do. That's what a leprechaun's there to do. When a mimic has a giant tongue, reach out and slap at somebody, are my players going to go, no, that doesn't make sense? No, that's what they do. That makes sense. So just what's the expectation that your players are going to have of the danger you're putting them in, and maybe telegraph the danger. That's always, best practice. It's a good one. It's one I harp on because I am working on it. I do stretch my roots, though they are thin, back to the early 80s, and the gotcha was a big part of my childhood role-playing experience. That's not very fun. Even as a young person GMing, the gotcha on your players wears out pretty quick when you see their disappointed faces. So what's the expectation? Telegraph that danger, and I think you'll probably be all right.
So I'm going to make it a little bit more concrete here for my second one, a little less wishy-washy and abstract and obtuse. Action economy is important. Pay attention to the number of attacks that a monster gets and what it can do on its turn per the rules. And then let that give you some guidance in terms of how many things the monster could potentially do on its turn if you want to play with it a little bit. Pay attention to the level of the monster and how that corresponds to how many. Oftentimes, a higher level monster will have more attacks, for instance, or just, maybe it can make an attack and cast a spell, for instance. And really, whenever you're allowing a monster to do more things on its turn, you're increasing its power by a considerable margin. And there are great reasons to do that, but also you want to be very careful when we're talking about how many things any given monster or character can do on its turn. That's when we start fussing with one of the core underpinnings of the system. So just be aware of that action economy and sometimes use it to your advantage.
Yeah, totally. When the big baddie's supposed to be big and bad, make him big and bad. Feels good. All right. I'm going to close out with using Kelsey's words directly from Shadowdark because, let's consult the tome. I'm on page 102, and I'm just going to give you what I've been looking at. The only rule, drawn from the center of this, the only rule is that you make the rules. What's written in this book is a guide, not a constraint, and none of it takes precedence over your judgment. The pact, you and your players are gaming together to have fun, prop each other up, and strengthen the bonds. This is the pact. Have a good time. Enjoy it.
All right, Jody. So as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you, wonderful listeners, were able to find something useful in our discussion you can take to a future game. If you have any questions or unique experiences from the table that you would like us to talk about and discuss in future episodes, head on over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord page. Look for links to any of the material we referenced in that thread on the Discord or in the show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadowdark Facebook page under the handle Pezman, and you can contact me via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, later, nerds. Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster. Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production that is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadowdark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library, copyright 2023.